Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're going to talk about Nietzsche against polyglots. Now, as you probably know, in his education and work, Nietzsche accorded plenty of importance to language. Before actually becoming a philosopher, he was first and foremost a philologist, and his reflections on language permeate his entire work. I have discussed this aspect here and here. Now, despite this, or precisely because of it, Nietzsche was very much against the idea of learning many languages. How so? Well, let's find out, shall we? I suggest we do a close reading of this explosive passage from the first volume of Human All Too Human, published in 1878, which, as you can see here on the screen, is a rather early period in his work. The passage in question belongs to section 5, Signs of Higher and Lower Culture, aphorism number 267. Shoutouts to Santiglot for having shared this with me.
The learning of many languages fills the memory with words instead of with facts and thoughts. And this is a vessel which, with every person, can only contain a certain limited amount of contents. So Nietzsche is saying here that when we learn new languages, we mostly incorporate words as opposed to facts and thoughts. And that because our memory is limited, we should privilege facts and thoughts over mere words. Of course, this is a false binary because, as I have explained in other videos, words are already connected with facts and thoughts. So by learning new words, we actually come to see reality and come to think about it in different ways. Now I continue reading the quote. Therefore, the learning of many languages is injurious inasmuch as it arouses a belief in possessing dexterity, and, as a matter of fact, it lends a kind of delusive importance to social intercourse. Now, we know that social interaction was not one of Nietzsche's forte. However, as Aristotle said, we are zoon politikon. We are political, social animals. So social interaction is part and parcel of learning many languages, but rather than being a detriment to the human experience, is actually an asset. Now I continue reading. It is also indirectly injurious in that it opposes the acquirement of solid knowledge and the intention to win the respect of men in an honest way. Again, here Nietzsche is establishing a false binary between acquiring languages, which he reduces to the acquisition of words on the one hand, and acquiring knowledge on the other. So he thinks learning languages is not equivalent to acquiring solid knowledge. On top of this, he thinks that by learning many languages, one gets the respect of other people, but that is not an honest way of earning that respect, because there is something delusive about speaking many languages. It is as if you were performing, as if you were putting on a show, a facade, rather than showing true value and talent. Now I continue. Finally, it is the axe which is laid to the root of a delicate sense of language in our mother tongue, which thereby is incurably injured and destroyed. Now here Nietzsche seems unaware of the fact that the category mother tongue, as I have explained in the video that you can click on above, is an ideological category. So Nietzsche thinks that learning new languages, this always happens at the expense of reducing our ability in our first language, which he calls mother tongue, which is not always the case, right? There are different models of bilingualism. We can speak of additive bilingualism, whereby the acquisition of more than one language has a positive net impact on both of the languages we're learning, or other forms of bilingualism, such as the one he is presupposing here, which is a bilingualism whereby the acquisition of one language takes place at the expense of the other. But again, that is not necessarily the case. That is just one way of understanding bilingualism. Now I continue reading. The two nations which produced the greatest stylists, the Greeks and the French, learned no foreign languages. Now, let's put aside, for the sake of the argument, the idea that nobody amongst the Greeks and the French learned any languages, which is a stretch. But let's assume its validity for the sake of the argument. Still, Nietzsche is reproducing here yet another pernicious linguistic ideology, which is that of thinking that quote-unquote foreign languages exist, i.e. the idea that there are languages that are intrinsically foreign. But as I have demonstrated in the video whose link you can find on top of this page, there is no such thing as foreign languages. Furthermore, this is a very divisive and injurious category that we should get rid of. Now I continue reading. But as human intercourse must always grow more cosmopolitan, and as, for instance, a good merchant in London must now be able to read and write 8 languages, the learning of many tongues has certainly become a necessary evil. Now, Nietzsche has been ironic here. I don't really think that he truly believed that a good merchant in London must be able to read and write 8 languages. He's exaggerating for the purpose of his argument. But the point is that in an increasingly globalized world, learning languages is going to become necessary. Now, whether that is a necessary evil only follows if you already assume that learning languages is something evil, as Nietzsche did. But as I think I have demonstrated in this YouTube channel, there is nothing intrinsically evil about learning languages. On the contrary, learning languages can help us make a difference, whether it is preserving an endangered language or using language to dismantle prejudices about people, as in racial linguistics, etc. I continue reading, but which, when finally carried to an extreme, will compel mankind to find a remedy, and in some far-off future there will be a new language, used at first as a language of commerce, then as a language of intellectual intercourse generally, then for all, as surely as sometime or other there will be aviation. Now this is, in my opinion, the most interesting part of this passage. Nietzsche believes that there is a pendulum swing, that as much as people might be learning more and more languages nowadays, this will necessarily lead to the opposite reaction. That the more languages people learn, the more eventually they will be compelled to, as he says, find a remedy, as if learning languages were a disease of some sort, which is to say, the more they will be compelled to just resort into one single language for all purposes. And again, I think there is a false binary here at stake. What is actually happening in our world is that yes, there has been aviation, as Nietzsche predicted, but his analogy between the inevitable technological development that leads to aviation and the supposed inevitability of learning many languages leading to learning just one language for all purposes has been proven wrong. What is happening nowadays is that we see the proliferation of polyglots and hyperpolyglots in parallel with the fact that English is by and large adopted for all intents and purposes, for commerce, for intellectual intercourse, and for all other areas of life. So rather than either people learning many languages or else people just resorting to one language, i.e. English, nowadays we're seeing both at the same time. People learning more and more languages and at the same time still using English as the lingua franca for almost every area of everyday life. And finally, Nietzsche brings his whole reflection on language in full circle with his education as a philologist when he says this: why else should philology have studied the laws of languages for a whole century and have estimated the necessary, the valuable, and the successful portion of each separate language. So there you go. He believes that the fact that philology has supposedly ascertained the amount of each specific language that should go into global communication proves that this will be the case, that a new language will emerge which contains bits and parts of all the languages and which will be used exclusively for the purpose of communicating, whether it is in commerce, intellectual intercourse, or other areas. But as I have explained, this has not been the case. Esperanto will be the closest to this, but still, it can hardly be said to be a lingua franca on a global scale.
So that's all from me. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Were you surprised at all by Nietzsche's negative take on learning many languages? I for once was. Thanks for watching. As always, see you in the next video.